So the Mongols in Europe. The Mongols are going to first set their sights on Russia. And when the Mongols arrive in Russia, Russia was divided into many small kingdoms, mostly based on trade. There was no real centralized rule, and the Russian princes refused to work together to try to stop the Mongols. And so the Mongols are going to actually attack in winter. The Mongols are one of the few, if not only, invaders to have success despite the Russian winter. They attacked in the winter because the frozen ground and snow actually provided better footing for their horses, and they could use the frozen rivers to attack as well. And so they're going to begin their attack in the winter, and the spring sets in, and as the snows begin to melt, it actually proved to be too muddy for their horses and too slippery. And so the Mongols actually retreat for several months, and they wait until the following winter to return and finish their conquest of Russia. And so when the Mongols take over Russia, they basically force the Russian princes to pay tribute to the Mongols. And for the next 2.5 centuries, Russia is going to have this tribute relationship with the Mongols. And it's going to have a big impact on the developments in Russia. First off, peasants were responsible for covering most of this tribute payment. And so now not only were peasants having to pay part of what they produced in the form of tribute to the Mongols, but they also had to continue to pay these Russian princes as well. And so the burden that placed on the peasants is going to force many of them into serfdom. And so it's because of the Mongols' invasion of Russia that we see the rise of serfdom spread in Russia. We're also going to see another side effect of the Mongol conquest in Russia is Moscow is going to gain some prestige, and they're going to gain some centralized rule. Moscow actually profited as they were the chief tribute collector for the Mongols. And so they start collecting tribute from the other princes and passing that on to the Mongols, and it kind of gave them some centralized rule. They then begin to annex surrounding towns and villages and continue to expand. The Orthodox Church is also going to benefit because they're going to basically choose Moscow as kind of their new center, their new capital. And so they're going to benefit. So both Moscow and the Orthodox Church actually benefit to some extent from Mongol rule. We're also going to see another side effect of the Mongol conquest in Russia is that for the next 2.5 to 3 centuries, Russia basically gets cut off from Western Europe. And for the next several centuries, Russia is actually going to have closer ties to Asia than they do to Western Europe. And so their trade and cultural exchanges tended to go through Asia instead of Europe. And it also means because they were kind of cut off from Western Europe, that they're going to miss out on some important developments that are going to take place in Western Europe, like the Renaissance and Reformation and other scientific developments. And so it kind of sets Russia back a little bit. All right, when we look at the rest of Europe, initially, when the rest of Europe first starts hearing about the Mongol invasions, they were kind of excited. They thought that Genghis Khan and the Mongols were fellow Christian allies. In fact, rumors start to spread about perhaps it's a return of King David coming back to save Christendom from the Muslims. Or rumors spread about Prester John, and Europeans thought that Genghis Khan was Prester John, who was supposed to be this kind of mythical Christian ally that was attacking the Muslim world. And early on, it appeared that that was the case. As the Muslims pushed into Persia and defeated the Persians and pushed into the Abbasid Caliphate and then defeated the Seljuk Turks. Well, then when the Mongols turned their attack on Russia, it became clear that perhaps they weren't the Christian allies that they had hoped for. And so then fear starts to spread. And the Mongols do begin pushing into Europe. And they defeat several forces, including Hungary. But Europe is basically saved from Mongol conquest because of luck. The death of the great Khan, the Grand Khan Ogadai, forces Batu, who was overseeing the invasion of Europe, forces Batu to return back to the Mongol homeland so that they could elect a next Grand Khan. And basically, the Mongols just never come back to Europe, partially because there really wasn't a whole lot there in terms of wealth that they were interested in. And perhaps Batu was content with kind of overseeing Russia and the Golden Horde. But Europe is basically saved from Mongol conquests because of the death of the Grand Khan. And so here's the four major Mongol empires. And so you had the empire of the Great Khan, the Grand Khan in the east. And that included China, the Yuan dynasty. And then in between, you had the Chagatai Khanate. This was kind of the part of the original homeland of the Mongols. And then you had Persia in the eastern Mediterranean that made up the Ilkhanate. And then you had the Golden Horde, which was Russia. And so when we look at the Mongols and their impact in these regions, they stayed and directly ruled China, and they stayed and directly ruled the Ilkhanate. A key difference, though, is the Golden Horde. They didn't directly rule Russia. Instead, they were content to just take tribute. When we look at the overall effects of the Mongols here, first off, they create the largest contiguous, continuous, land-based empire in all of history. And yes, initially they were extremely brutal, but once their empire was created, we have this period known as the Pax Mongolica. And this was a period of peace and stability and prosperity in the Mongol Empire. And they helped protect trade routes. And so trade is going to flourish throughout this region. And again, even though they could be disruptive, they were also very tolerant as well. And another thing they were good at was using the strengths of different peoples in their empire, using Persians and Turks in their bureaucracy where needed. They also, again, even though they might go into a city and kill all the inhabitants, they oftentimes would leave scholars and craftsmen and artisans alive. And they would take these skilled craftsmen back to their capital. And so overall, yes, the Mongols were brutal, but there were also some positives like this period of peace and prosperity. When we look at reasons for the decline of the Mongols, first off, the biggest reason for the decline of the Mongols is simply they were too few in number. They were a nomadic group and trying to rule these huge populations, and there were simply too few of them. And so there was always resistance to Mongol rule, and gradually, especially in places like the Ilkhanate, they become assimilated into that society. And so that was really their biggest issue, was they were simply too few in numbers. Another thing that's going to change is the use of firearms. Firearms kind of negated a lot of the strengths that the Mongols had. Guns kind of made their mobility less effective. And so gunpowder weapons are really going to change the Mongols as well. And so as we look at their collapse, I'm going to start with their collapse of the Ilkhanate. This is Persia. The biggest reason for their decline in the Ilkhanate is they become assimilated into the culture. And basically what happens is the last Mongol ruler of the Ilkhanate dies without an heir, and this is going to leave a power vacuum in the Ilkhanate. When we look at the decline of the Yuan dynasty, first off, power struggles begin to develop. And we're going to see gradually the image of the Mongols as being this great invincible force is going to decline. And it's going to come for a couple of reasons. First off, they try on a couple separate occasions to take Japan. And in both cases, Japan is saved by what the Japanese call the kamikaze, these divine winds that brought in storms that devastated the Mongolian ships trying to reach Japan. And so defeats in Japan and also defeats in Vietnam, their failure to take Vietnam, showed the rest of China that perhaps the Mongolians weren't as invincible as they thought. And then another big reason for the decline of the Mongols is the spread of the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague probably originated in the Mongolian homelands in Central Asia. And then as the Mongols expanded, they helped spread the Black Death. As they protected these trade routes, the Black Death was spread along these trade routes. And there's also examples and stories of the Mongols purposefully spreading the Black Death. For example, they would set up sieges around cities and they would fling infected bodies into the city and infect these cities with bubonic plague. And so the bubonic plague begins to spread, and that impacted the Mongols just like it did many other parts of the world. And the Mongol population is going to decline even further, making it harder for them to keep control of these territories. Now, even though ultimately the Ilkhanate collapses and that leaves a power vacuum there, the Yuan dynasty is going to fall and it's going to be replaced by a new Ming dynasty. The Mongols do not completely disappear. The Golden Horde that kind of controlled Russia and collected tribute from Russia is going to continue, and the Mongols would continue to be a force in Central Asia as well.